Sweet Mother Michigan, Father Superior, coming down from Mackinac and Sault Ste. Marie. Blue water Huron rolls down to Lake Erie, falls into Ontario and runs on out to sea. The Great Lakes are a diamond on the hand of North America.
You have come upon the Great Lakes Guys podcast. We're just a couple of guys, Randy and Chris, who formed a podcast about all things Great Lakes. The podcast features not only the history, geography, and geology of the land, waters, and people of the Great Lakes Basin, but as well we interview talented people from around the region who form the innovative cultural web of music, arts, technology, and science of the Great Lakes Basin. And before getting to the podcast interview, we would like to thank Lee Murdoch, the Great Lakes balladeer, who allowed us to use his recording of the song The Great Lakes Song. The Great Lakes Song was originally composed by Pat Daly, another prominent balladeer of the Great Lakes. Today on the podcast, we interview author Wayne Grady. Wayne is an accomplished author of books across a wide range of genres, including popular science books, fiction and travel books, as well as English translations of French novels. The reason for us to have Wayne on the podcast is that he is an excellent observer and documentarian of the life and ecology of the planet. He has written several books that are of interest to the general reader regarding past and present day life, including Bringing Back the Dodo, Tree, A Life Story, Bone Museum, Vulture, Nature's Ghastly Gourmet, The World of the Coyote, and the book that we will mostly be talking about today, The Great Lakes, A Natural History of a Changing Region. Wayne is a lover of the Great Lakes. He has spent most of his life within the Great Lakes Basin, but, as he notes, he would rather be on the lakes. As proof, he once took a freighter from Thunder Bay, Ontario in Lake Superior to the mouth of the St. Lawrence River. We have asked Wayne to give us his views on how climate change is now manifest in the Great Lakes region. What might be different between now and when he published the Great Lakes book in 2011? At the end of the podcast, we also briefly discuss his new book, Pandexicon, how a new vocabulary grew out of the COVID pandemic. The connection here today with our present topic is the influence of climate change on the potential for future pandemics.
I was born in Windsor, so we're all from the same
area.
Yeah.
You were born in Windsor, and I noticed you translated a bunch of literary works from French into English. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And so are you was French your first language, or was it your second, or tied for first?
Yeah, no, I have no connections to the French around Windsor at all. I moved to I went to university in Ottawa and then moved to Montreal after that, and that's when I started reading and speaking French.
Very interesting.
So yeah, I didn't
University of British Columbia, is that where you?
Carleton.
Oh, that's right.
Carleton in Ottawa. Yeah.
I read your bio and I noticed that.
Yeah, I've hardly ever lived outside the Great Lakes Basin.
You wrote this rather beautiful book, The Great Lakes. You know, it's quite the photography is quite amazing, and your choice of topics I think is a bit unusual. You know, so that's what makes it kind of attractive, because you kind of talk about things that other people don't talk about. I mean, they're talked about in some places, but you've kind of gathered them in.
Yeah, it's meant to be a natural history.
Yeah.
And in my other, I'm a science writer and an environmental writer, and so for me, natural history includes human history.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wanted to write about just everything to do with the Great Lakes and from an environmental point of view.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it was a huge job. They gave me a year to do it in, They originally wanted me to do it in 3 months. I don't know,
Oh.
like publishers are crazy, right?
Oh, 3 months. My God.
This is an area the size of, Alberta.
Mm.
Hmm,
So
very
anyway,
interesting. Yeah, and Randy and I, we've also talked about how, as you know, the richness of the Great Lakes seems to be a relatively well-kept secret. We were just sort of reminiscing. I don't remember learning anything specifically about the Great Lakes per se in any of my, K through 12 and university education. And so
right.
that's where you came in. And relatively recently, we interviewed Professor Emeritus David Kessler from University of Michigan, and he wrote like this very authoritative book on, I think it was called Great Lakes Rocks,
Yes.
and it was
Oh, yeah, I've got that book.
do you
Oh,
really?
Yeah, that's one of
Yeah,
the books I consulted for the chapter on geology.
yeah.
Oh, wait a minute. Maybe it was Manitoulin rocks. Anyway.
No, well, okay.
It's funny. Yeah. So, well, go ahead,
Geology
Randy.
is geology is not an easy subject for me anyway. It was a
Well,
real.
there's only hundreds of rocks named ending in ite or something like that.
Starting with SH.
Yeah.
I'm not a guru, and I'm not a scientist. So, I'm a writer, and so
Yeah.
what I know is the research that I've done and people that I've talked to. So I don't know everything, but I'm happy to talk about what I do know.
Okay.
Yeah, and I noticed you have written a lot of I mean, I again, I took a few minutes to look up your background. And you have a lot of science writing background. And the first thing that caught my mind is, and I think I know why, but if you can maybe start with what specifically motivated you to write about the Great Lakes in particular, given that you have written a lot of fiction, nonfiction, and done a lot of translations. What was your motivation?
Sure. Yeah. You want me to start now?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, as you say, I have written a lot about science. I've talked to a lot of scientists. What I usually have done is travel with scientists. I traveled with Phil Curry to write a couple of books about dinosaurs. I traveled with one of my early books in the early 1990s. I traveled to the North Pole with 70 atmospheric and ice scientists to look for early signs of global warming in the north. And that was at a time when many people were denying that there was such a thing as global warming, including many of the people who reviewed my book when it came out.
You're talking about the quiet limit of the world.
The quiet limit of the world. Yeah, it was 1994. I was on the first ship that crossed the Arctic Ocean east to west over the North Pole. It was an historic trip as well as a great scientific trip. And we were looking for early signs of global warming. And so I wrote one of the early books of global warming, and was very aware of what global warming was doing to us in general, but also to the Great Lakes in particular. So when Greystone, the publisher, approached me and asked me if I would write, what they really wanted was a natural history of Ontario, and I said, well, I think what's happening to the Great Lakes is more interesting than what's happening to other places in Ontario. And there's more to write about. There are more people studying what was happening in the Great Lakes. There are more people to talk to. And so I suggested we modify his requests a little bit, and I write about the Great Lakes. And they were very happy to do that. I mean, the Great Lakes Basin is almost like a separate country, right? I mean, it's got 35 million people living in it. It's got a coastline that's as long as the Atlantic or the Pacific coastlines, and it's got more shipping in it, more activity, more commercial activity going in it than almost all of the rest of Canada combined. So there was a lot to write about, and especially from an environmental point of view. And so I was interested in the animals, in the fish, in the forests, and in the people. and what was happening to them. And the more research I did, the more I looked into it, I realized that not much was being done about some of the really terrible things that were taking place in the Great Lakes at that time. Invasive species, for example, no one was really addressing the problem of stopping ships from bringing invasive species in. There was talk about water diversion projects, people bottling water, putting water in super tanks and shipping it to China. And the Army, the United States Army Corps of Engineers had been working on a project to pump water out of Lake Superior into the north of the Mississippi River to provide more water for Texas, which was going through a drought. All those kinds of things were being talked about, and I found it very worrisome that these kinds of projects were being seriously discussed at really high levels of government. So I thought, I wanted to write a book and sort of alert people to what was interesting about the Great Lakes, what was great about the Great Lakes, but also what some of the dangers were and some of the threats to it that I saw. That's sort of been what I do what I did as a journalist. I was a magazine journalist for many years before I started writing books, and it's what I did with my Arctic book, my Quiet Limit of the World, and other kinds of things, other science books that I was writing. I spent a lot of time. I know a year doesn't sound like a lot of time, and I wrote the book in the course of a year, but I had done I researched it for a while before I started writing. And I also had a great science panel. I found 5 scientists around who had been writing and studying the Great Lakes, and got them to read the manuscript before I published it, just to give it a scientific look to make sure that and it was a really good thing in some cases. As I said earlier, geology is not my strong suit, and I thought I had it right, and I gave it to the head of geology at Queen's University in Kingston to read over for me. His notes were quite lengthy about things I could change.
You published that in 2007, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, the first edition, the hardcover, came out in 2007, and then in 2011, the revised paperback edition came out. It wasn't hugely revised, as not much had changed between 2007 and 2011. But I corrected typos, and I actually, in the first edition, don't tell anyone, but I said there were only 7 American states around the Great Lakes. I don't know. I missed one. There are 8.
Yeah.
See which one that was. Maybe Indiana. You missed Indiana, maybe.
I forget. Maybe Ohio. I don't know.
Ohio.
But
so I'd like to ask. You had at least 3 chapters on the different kinds of forests.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There are 5 forest regimes around the Great Lakes. Yeah.
Okay.
And they each have different trees, different animals in them, different environmental or different ecosystems.
Yeah.
And they all had different impacts on the Great Lakes. Everything from the boreal forest in the north down to the Carolinian forest in the south.
The reason I ask is it would seem that all these different environments are kind of butting up against one another, and it seems like that would become a fairly sensitive indicator of climate change, because they're all interacting with each other in such a rather small geographic area, in a sense.
Yeah, they're interacting with each other, and they're also moving, right? The Carolinian forest is moving north. Having grown up around Windsor and southwestern Ontario, the Carolinian forest was sort of my native forest, I guess. And it's now I live in Ontario, north of Kingston, Ontario, and a lot of the trees that are in the forest there that used to be sort of the Great Lakes broadleaf mixed forest have a lot of Carolinian species in them now.
Yeah.
And that's been happening for a long time, but it's speeding up quite a lot these days. So there's a lot of overlap between the 5 forests, except farther north. I mean, boreal forest is pretty much boreal forest. There's not a lot of new trees growing up in there. But as global warming increases, we're going to be seeing a lot more, not only tree species and plant species, but animal species moving north, and insect species.
Yes. Can you just briefly describe for the audience, at least the 3 types that you mentioned in the book, and what characterizes them? And
Sure.
yeah.
Starting from the north, the boreal forest is basically black spruce, and it's a deciduous forest. It's where all the birds go when they migrate north. A lot of them. It's one of the economically important forests. Is a lot of the forest industry that takes place in northern Canada is boreal forests that they're cutting down. It comes down south to about the top of Lake Superior, a little bit into Manitoulin Island in northern Ontario. Basically, south of that, there's the I think it's just called the Laurentian Forest, the Great Lakes Laurentian Forest. That's the one that most of us know about. It's a temperate forest, mixed hardwood and deciduous. Mixed hardwood and coniferous. It's the maple, oak, pine. When the first settlers came to North America in the early 1800s, Ontario anyway, and a lot of the other parts of the Great Lakes Basin was basically white pine. These big 300-foot tall trees, 12 feet around. They really set about cutting as many of those down as fast as they could, creating farms and selling the wood into Europe. And then sort of south of that, south of Lake Ontario, Lake Erie, we're getting into the Carolinian forest, the northern edge of the Carolinian forest, and then you get beech trees, sugar maple. Sugar maple is actually, there's a lot of sugar maple in Ontario, but it's actually a Carolinian species. Different oaks, bur oak, an oak that starts with Q, Quinn something oak. Anyway, and that's the forest that is, all of those forests are on the move because of global warming. But those are the 3 principal ones that most people living in the Great Lakes Basin will be familiar with.
Okay. Chris?
Well, here's a question for you. So there's climate change happening. Is it causing a positive, a negative, or neutral effect, or is it too early to tell, in your opinion?
It's not too early to tell. It's almost too late to tell. There's nothing positive about global warming. Politicians in Canada try to say, well, what's wrong with warmer summers? Farmers will be able to grow more crops. They'll have a longer growing season, et cetera, et cetera. No, it's global warming is the one biggest threat to the future survival of the human race on the planet that we have ever seen and are ever likely to see. Scientists started warning us about global warming in the early 1980s. And said, okay, we have 10 years. We have in 1985, I think they said, we have 10 years to turn this around, or we're going to be overwhelmed by rising temperatures and the huge consequences that come from rising temperatures. Nothing was done. Yes, there were international conferences. Promises were made, agreements were signed, but essentially we're pumping out more carbon into the atmosphere now than we have ever done, and it's just gone beyond the point where I personally believe, I'm not alone in this, but I believe that it's too late to stop it. It's too late to maybe even slow it down. I mean, the best thing we can do now is to figure out what we're going to do, how we're going to change
Adapt.
our
Yeah.
growing, our living habits
Yeah.
to accommodate it. And in terms of the Great Lakes, the really hard, devastating effects of global warming on the lakes, we see it mostly in the winter.
Yes. Yes.
When the ice cover on the lakes is crucial to keeping those lakes the way they are supposed to be, and because of the albedo effect, if the lakes are frozen, I learned this when I was in the Arctic, because I was up the North Pole when there was still ice up there, and now that the ice is gone, the change in the surface temperature of the water there is exponential. It's just spiked. It's just gone straight up, and that's what's happening with the Great Lakes. When a lake is totally covered with ice, it's white and it reflects light and energy from the sun. When it's dark, when there's no ice, the water is dark and it absorbs more energy and more heat from solar rays, and so those lakes are evaporating and warming up 12 months a year now instead of just the summer, during the summer. That has huge consequences. I know that I just, in preparation for today's talk, I looked up the current water levels in the lakes, and they're a couple of inches down from what they ideally should be, but those are regulated. Those water levels are controlled in Lake Superior, and again downstream in near Iroquois in the St. Lawrence River. But when the water levels go down, as they were when I wrote the book, the water levels in Lake Huron, for example, were down a couple of feet. When those water levels are down, there are three major effects that are very, very dangerous to all of us. One is that the more of the shoreline is exposed. So when we talked in the early 20, 30 years ago about the high pollution rates in the Great Lakes, when I wrote the book, people were saying, oh, the water's clearer now. The water's a lot less polluted than it was 20 years ago, 15 years ago. What we're doing must be working. Well, yes, in one sense that's true, but what really was happening was that the pollution in the water had settled down into the sediments at the bottom of the lakes. When the lake levels are low, more of the shoreline is exposed. Some places around Chicago, I just heard, is like they've lost 100 feet of shoreline. The shoreline is 100 feet in from where it used to be, and cottagers around Lake Huron also complained that they lost shoreline because when they bought the cottage, the water was way over there, and now it's right up here. When that shoreline is exposed, the soil dries out, and the wind comes up and picks up all that pollution that's settled out of the water column into the sediments. So all that what used to be water pollution now becomes air pollution, and we breathe that. So that's one of the problems. Another problem is that ships that are carrying goods from through the Great Lakes can't go through fully loaded because their draft is too low. The water level's too low. So let's say the Welland Canal can take a ship that's with a 50-foot draft. That's when the water levels are high. When the water levels are low, they can only take a 48-foot draft or a 47-foot draft, which means that those ships cannot fill their holds to capacity. When I wrote the book, the ships were already traveling at about 10%, 90% capacity, which means that they had to make 10% more trips in order to carry the same amount of cargo from one end of the lakes to the other, which meant they were burning 10% more bunker fuel, putting 10% more carbon into the atmosphere, and just basically polluting the air again more than they ought to be. The third problem that of lower lake levels was that not as much water was going over the hydro dam in Niagara Falls, and so they had to divert more water. The argument was actually, gee, we can't divert more water away from Niagara Falls because that would affect the tourism industry. They wouldn't be as spectacular as they are when all the water that's supposed to go over them goes over them. So it's better to have rolling brownouts around all around the Great Lakes Basin because we didn't have enough electricity. We weren't producing enough electricity to combat global warming because of all the extra air conditioning that was being required. So it's a loop, right? I mean, global warming isn't just longer summers and longer growing seasons. It's a huge, huge thing. The other thing is that I think about people who think that global warming could not be as bad as we think it is it's an ethical thing for me, and because if it's warmer for us, it's way warmer for people around the equator. If we accept that global warming isn't going to be devastating to the northern United States, southern Canada, as some people are saying it would be, we're actually saying we're condemning millions of people to living in who are living around the equator to just uninhabitable conditions. Many of whom are going to be migrating to the Great Lakes Basin. So it's one of those all-consuming, all-encompassing problems that we really, I know people are doing a lot to address it, but we haven't been doing enough to address it.
Well, I think people, I mean, I've heard it said, I can't remember where I heard it, but it rings true. I mean, human beings are good at reacting to problems, but we're not good at preventing them. So I think, I mean, and this is, I mean, it's true for me, I think, but I know a lot when I teach, I dedicate a lot of my teaching to sustainable energy and green energy. And I mean, along your comment about just the ethics of it all, it just seems to be so inherently wrong to dig something out of the ground and burn it, I mean, and then the other part of me says
especially when we have other things we could be doing. I mean,
exactly. And that's where I think I see it as opportunity, is that there's just such a huge opportunity for science and technology and engineering to come up with alternative ways of powering our society. And just from just a flat out scientific point of view, I mean, that's a great challenge to sink my teeth into.
Yeah. It's sad that we've allowed well, I wrote one of my books was about technology, and one of the points I made in that book was that we have become so human beings, the relationship between human beings and technology is now like the relationship between farm animals and farmers. We depend on technology for our survival and our existence, and we create a problem with one kind of technology and then try to come up with another kind of technology to deal with that problem, and it's like the old lady who swallowed a fly. But there's one more point I wanted to make about global warming that I have not heard made very often or often enough, and that is when we talk about the average global temperature going up 1.5 degrees, 1 degree, 1.5, 2 degrees, we're talking about the average global temperature. That means, and when I was at the North Pole, it became clear. I was one of the scientists explained to me, when the average temperature goes up 1 degree, the average global temperature goes up 1 degree, it goes up almost almost none at the equator, and it goes up 8 degrees at the North Pole. So the Great Lakes are at around halfway, around 45, 46 degrees latitude. So if it goes up 0 at the equator and 8 degrees at the North Pole, it goes up about 4 degrees where we are in the Great Lakes. That's the average temperature. So on an average hot summer day would be, well, in Canada, it would be 25 degrees Celsius. When the average global temperature goes up 1 degree, it's going to be 30 degrees Celsius in Chicago or Toronto, and that's when
hot.
The number of 30 plus degrees, that's hot. That's like 86, 85 degrees. The number of those days goes up every year. Every year we have more plus 35, 30 more plus 30 degrees than we did the year before. More air conditioning, more people are going into hospitals, more just more problems more pollution, pollution lingering longer, car pollution lingering longer in the air. The cities are will become uninhabitable. It's it's again, it's one of it's that loop. But the really important thing is that people think, oh, if the global average temperature goes up 1 degree, what big deal? Well, it's actually going to go up 4 degrees, 4 or 5 degrees in the Great Lakes area. When it goes up, and scientists are now talking about what 3 degrees by the end of the century. Well, that will be 12 degrees in the Great Lakes area, and so it's huge. I mean, there'll be no ice. There'll be the winters. There'll be no snow cover in the winter. All the biological systems that require cold winters and snow cover won't happen. Won't get it. So
well, I just like to mention, that I grew up in northern Lower Michigan, on Lake Huron, on Tawas Bay, and we would have ice cover on the bay until March, into March.
Yeah.
Now it's gone. There's hardly any ice in the winter now, and hardly any snow.
Yeah.
And it's really quite noticeable. It's just happened in one lifetime that that the winter has really changed radically.
One of the places I used to live in, north of Toronto, there was a lake that froze over every year, and someone in the wintertime would push an old car out into the middle of the lake on the ice, and then they would sell tickets as to like when that car would sink through the ice, like the date, and it was like a lottery. They can't do it anymore.
Yeah, they can't do it.
It's never frozen over enough for them to push a car out on, or a snowmobile, or even go cross country skiing on the. I mean, it's and that's, you're right. That's within one lifetime.
Yeah.
And one of the things that worries me is that is the concept of the tipping point. Things sort of move along at a kind of a plateau, changing slightly, but then at some point things start accelerating and going, and the change, if you're charting the change, the chart would go like this for a while, and all of a sudden everything would spike. And one of the things that when I was writing my Great Lake, my Arctic book, one of the things I learned was that in doing ice cores of glacier ice in Greenland, back when there was glacier ice in Greenland, they went down. They did ice cores, and every year every year was represented by a layer of ice in this core. When they got to the layers at the end of the ice age, they discovered that the ice age ended, and the current temperate climate began in a 10-year period. So we had an ice age for however many thousands of years, and then that stopped happening, and we have our current climate within a 10-year period. That's what I mean by spiking. Everything spikes, and when we reach that tipping point, there would be no going back. I mean, I have I'm not entirely apocryphal. I mean, I'm not out there holding up the end. Now is the end of the world signs. But I do worry about my kids and my grandkids, what kind of planet they're going to be living on, where they can live, what it's going to be like for them. They worry.
Do you still stay, I mean, just in general, how connected do you remain to your past works? Like, do you still stay pretty closely connected to the goings-ons within the Great Lakes? And you wrote a book called Technology in the Bone Museum. Do you kind of just step out of that, a project like that, and onto the next adventure? Or do you keep up?
I certainly I don't keep up in a very active sense. I mean, I check the news coverage. I read Bill McKibben's Substack every couple of weeks. What I have written in the past has informed the kinds of things that I pay attention to now. I wrote a book about coyotes. I look around for coyotes every time I go for a walk in the country, and when I I live in the city of Kingston now, but I used to live about an hour north of there in the farming country. And I used to lie awake at night and hear coyotes calling to each other at night. And I knew what they were doing. I mean, it was a great, didn't fill me with fear. I didn't tell my kids to lock the doors and all that kind of thing. I just said, oh, it's great. They're just talking to each other. And when farmers blame coyotes for killing lambs or sheep, I said, no, it wasn't coyotes. It was dogs.
Really?
Yeah, I actually, yeah. So, and the work I did writing books about dinosaurs, one of my last book about dinosaurs, The Bone Museum, which you mentioned, was about the fact that dinosaurs, not all dinosaurs went extinct. They evolved into birds. So my book was one of the first books to write about that theory that birds had actually evolved from dinosaurs. So now I'm a big birder. One of the reasons we come to Mexico is for the birds. And when I see a bird, I see a dinosaur. And it's so yeah, I've been keeping up with research in paleontology, and especially in environmental, the work I've been doing in the environment. I mean, how can one not be aware of changes in environmental science and discoveries? And
do you see yourself doing a new edition or a next edition for any of these works, like Great Lakes, for example?
If things change a lot, then I would, yeah. But right now, I don't think there would be much to write about that has changed. And again, in preparation for this interview, I just Googled invasive species in the Great Lakes, because one of the chapters in the book was invasive species, and I identified probably the 5 most common invasive species. And so when I Googled it yesterday, the same 5 species came up. I mean, which at first I thought, oh, nothing's changed. Then I realized, oh, wait a minute, that means they've stopped new invasive species from coming in. So that's a good thing. They're now requiring, the IJC is now requiring ships or forbidding ships to dump their ballast tanks in the Great Lakes, as they used to do. They used to, when a ship came in without a cargo to pick up a cargo, they would fill their ballast tanks with water from the Caspian Sea or wherever they came from, and then empty them in the Great Lakes before filling up with whatever they were filling up with, your iron ore pellets or whatever. And so whatever species that they picked up from elsewhere, that's how they got into the Great Lakes. So they're not allowed to do that anymore. So we haven't had, there aren't any, as far as I could tell, there aren't any horrible new invasive species that are taking over the Great Lakes biology. When I wrote the book, it astounded me to learn. We all know about zebra mussels and quagga mussels. What I didn't know about was the round goby. The round goby is a little fish that's about a 3-inch fish that came into the Great Lakes on a ship that dumped it came in from the Caspian Sea, that dumped its ballast tanks in Lake St. Clair or somewhere around there. And within 10 years, the round goby had expanded so much that it accounted for 50% of the biomass of the aquatic biomass in the Great Lakes. 50%. So if you took all the fish out of the Great Lakes and weighed them, half of that weight would be round gobies, which I just found totally astonishing.
How is that not widely known or front page news on a daily basis?
Yeah, I know. It's astounding.
Well, we do have that threat from what is it, the Chinese carp or whatever it is that's coming from the Mississippi?
The frankenfish.
Pardon?
The frankenfish.
The frankenfish. It knocks people out of canoes.
Yeah. I've seen pictures. I mean, and they leap like, 6, 7 feet out of the water and just knock people over on their
Yeah.
boat. Yeah.
Yeah, and that I haven't heard anything along those lines recently. I haven't
Yeah.
heard, like the worry was 15 years ago that they were going to, fill up the Great Lakes and as around Gobi have it. I haven't heard that happening. I know they built an electric fence across the Chicago outlet,
Yeah.
and that prevented a lot of foreign fish, non-Great Lakes fish, from getting into the Great Lakes. Yeah, that was a really frightening one. But people, I was also amazed at what happened when people dumped their goldfish bowls into Lake Ontario or something. What those fish become, because goldfish are carp, and they
Yes.
expand to fit their containers. So if you
They
put
get
them in a
big,
large
yes.
tank, they get big. If you put them in a Great Lake, they get huge.
Hmm.
I saw one photograph of a guy holding a carp that he'd caught that was bigger than he was.
Whoa. Whoa.
Yeah.
Oh.
So yeah, but those are sort of manageable things like
Mhm.
goldfish and mud turtles that or painted turtles that people
Mhm.
buy a turtle at Kresge's or Woolworths, and then when the kids go to where kids get tired of them, they just flush them down the toilet or let them go in lakes, and they get big, but they're just nice little turtles.
Are there still what's the current state of like water access issues, contention? Have those settled down? That seemed to be like all the rage a while ago.
So water access, you mean
Yeah.
You mean
being able to
taking water from the lakes? Is that what you mean? Or
Yeah, well, when you mentioned, I mean,
Mhm.
just shipping water to the Mississippi
Oh yeah,
River.
right. Yeah, so the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement that was signed in 1987, and then there was uh, a revision to it that had prevented water from being taken out of the Great Lakes permanently, with a few exceptions. So what that means was you couldn't take water out of one lake and dump it into another one. So you couldn't take water out of Lake Huron, use it to cool your nuclear power plant, and then dump it into Lake Ontario. You had to put it back into Lake. You could take it out, cool your plant, and then dump it back into Lake Huron, and that created all kinds of problems, which I can talk about. But the other thing you couldn't do was pump water into a tanker and ship it out to somewhere else outside the Great Lakes. But they had exemptions to those rules. One of the exemptions was the Chicago outlet, which water was being going out through the Chicago outlet into the Illinois River, into the Mississippi. That had been going on for years, and they couldn't actually stop that from happening because the pollution in the Chicago harbor would have just become too much. The other exemption was a curious one, and it almost sounded like an episode from a television series. It exempted water being used for commercial or manufacturing purposes. That means that Nestle's, for example, can bottle water in Michigan, and can up to I think the last count from 2005 to 2015, they took 3.4 billion gallons of water out of Lake Michigan. They can bottle it and sell it. Their argument is that they're selling most of it in the Great Lakes Basin, so it's not really leaving the basin.
very indirectly, it gets back, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. Turning water into water. But since then, there have been numerous companies have applied for permits to do the same thing. And those permits have not been granted. There's a company called Foxconn, a Chinese company that's applied for a permit to bring in to bottle something like 7 million gallons of water a day. And their permit has not been granted. I mean, it's being reviewed. No one has actually yet stood up and said, no, you're never going to be able to do this. But it's under review, and eventually probably it'll go away. On the other hand, Pfizer, I don't know if you know about Pfizer, has a plant in Michigan that uses a couple of million gallons of water a day to make probably COVID vaccine.
Mhm.
So we don't really want to stop that, but let's just hope that most of that vaccine is being used in the Great Lakes Basin.
Mm.
It's yeah, no, so the problem of water diversion, that's called diversion,
Right.
is still there. We have to divert water from, there were rivers that were diverted in northern Ontario, that used to drain into James Bay. They were diverted to drain into Lake Superior to keep the water levels up. That's diversion. Water gets diverted out of the Great Lakes through the canal systems. It's a real issue, and I think mainly it has to be as the southern states, the Ogallala aquifer is dry. Texas and Southern California, South Carolina are all getting very, very dry. The pressure on, depending on who becomes the next president of the United States, the pressure on, they're going to be looking at the water sitting in the Great Lakes and thinking, gee, we can use that down here. They're already doing that in Alberta. Diverting water from Alberta into the northern United States. The plan I mentioned earlier of the United States Army Corps of Engineers to divert water from Lake Superior to through North Dakota into Upper Mississippi River. It was stopped because it was too expensive. They would have to build 3 hydro plants between Duluth and North Dakota. Well, that's not going to be a deterrent in the future when the rest of the country is drying up, and all this water is sitting in Lake Superior. It's not going to be too expensive to get it out of there. So I think the problems, the future problems that we're going to be facing are protecting the water that's there. Right now, the usual wisdom is that the Great Lakes contain 20% of the world's drinkable water. Well, that's probably more like 25 or 30% now because of the another 20% used to be Arctic ice. And glaciers in Greenland and glaciers in Alaska. Well, they're melting so fast that water is no longer available as drinkable water. So that means that the percentage of water in the Great Lakes of the world's water is getting higher and higher. Another 20%, I think, was Lake Baikal in Russia, and that's pretty inaccessible for you can't run a tanker into Lake Baikal, fill it up, and then take it to China. But you can do that in Lake Ontario and Lake Huron and the Great Lakes. So the challenges in the future are going to, I hate to sound protectionist, but we've got to preserve this water. 20 million people, is it 20 million? 30 million people who live around the lakes rely on Great Lakes water, Great Lakes for their drinking water. And something like, I forget what percentage of Canada's agriculture anyway, depends on taking water from the Great Lakes for irrigation. It would be devastating if that water was not available.
Yeah. Very, very worrisome. I'm just I think I've heard that 20% of the world's fresh waters in the great, like you said, probably even greater now.
Yeah.
And a much, what I think I read one of your statistics. Did you say it's like 95% of North America's fresh water resides in the Great Lakes?
Yeah. 20% of 25% of the world's, but 90%, 95% of North America's. And because we've pumped so much water out of things like the Ogallala aquifer in the Midwest, they're not going, that water had been in there since the ice ages melted. So it took us 10, 14,000 years to empty it, and it's not going to fill up anytime soon.
Yes.
That's what I was curious about. Like what's replenishing the Great Lakes? I'm just looking at a list here. It's precipitation, runoff, tributaries and rivers and groundwater. And it seems like all of those sources themselves are going to be, you know,
Yeah.
stressed or running into their own shortages.
Yeah, precipitation is a kind of a false uh, benefit, because as more water evaporates from the lakes, there'll be more precipitation.
Mm,
And so it's actually raining our own water back onto us. So it's not a net gain of water.
right.
It's just the water being circulated. Uh, the rivers flowing into the lakes, especially the northern rivers from northern Ontario, are still flowing well. I mean, they're still viable. Um, I think I don't know, some of the lakes in northern United States, some of the rivers flowing into the lakes from the northern states are still doing that. Um, in those instances, I think the problem will be pollution rather than
Mm,
quantity. Um, but yeah,
interesting. Do you have you worked with or been contacted by lawmakers in Canada or the United States?
no, I haven't. Um, but no, I haven't.
Well, you should be.
Yeah.
Well, we all should be.
Yeah, but you're I mean you tell this I mean you recount the situation very eloquently and it's I mean you've given me uh a much better I think understanding and I feel more sensitive now towards this issue than I did 45 minutes ago and I consider myself a staunch environmentalist and
Yeah,
an
yeah,
ecologist and so it's I think a lot, probably the number one problem is complacency. Just people get
yeah.
lulled into complacency. And I think a lot of people think, I heard this conversation the other day in my classroom. Um, was two students who attend the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. They're computer engineering majors, and they were talking about this subject. It was during break, and they didn't know I was listening, but I couldn't help it. It's a small room, and they were talking about
Someone's
global
always
warming.
listening.
Yes, I'm always listening. Um, and they were saying they don't think global warming will become an issue. And I think, like I said, remember, and I didn't want to chime in, but I came so close to it. But one said, if global warming ever becomes a real issue, by that point, artificial intelligence will be able to provide technological solutions. I think, oh my
Yeah,
God.
yeah.
So
One
like so
technology will solve the problem that other technologies have caused.
Yeah.
yeah, and it's okay just to be continue to waste and continue to dig fossil fuels out of the ground and burn fossil fuels. Why? Because at some point AI will save us.
Yeah.
It's just
Well, the really worrisome thing from that conversation for me is that the guys, whoever it was, said, if global warming ever becomes a problem.
Yeah.
yeah, and actually that was sort of the nudge that was in my mind when I said like from your point of view, because I don't want to assume anything one way or the other. Like, do is it a what's the threat level? Are we like DEF CON red right now? Or, I mean, and so that's why I mean I'm totally agreeing with you. I just wanted to make
Yeah,
sure that
yeah,
uh
yeah.
that we were on the same page, and I think we are.
I think
Well,
so.
I
Yeah.
think that, the young people, young people, maybe in their 20s, they don't realize how much change there's been in the last 50 years,
Yeah,
I
we
think,
have that perspective, and we know
yes,
like we were talking
yeah,
earlier, we know what things were like 50 or 60 years ago.
yeah,
Um, and um, and the changes have been remarkable. I mean, the change, people talk about how many changes, the huge change in the 20th century from someone born in 1900,
Mm,
with horses and buggies, and by the time they were 75 years old, they were flying, in jets, international jets, and talking and taking photographs with their phones.
yeah.
Uh, but the change in our lifetime has been huge. I mean, just I don't even think about keeping up with the news anymore. I mean, I deal with what I can. I can sort of connect to a Zoom link, but don't ask me to how that happens. But and in some ways, it's just it's you're right that people there are people who are, well, people who, depending on where people get their news, and that's another question. People who get their news from social media, which is where I think I read somewhere that 80% of people under 30 get all of their news from Instagram and from Facebook and various places. Well, who knows where that news is coming from? We don't even know what country that news is coming from anymore. And that kind of source of information, very, very dubious, uncheckable, and it's just being absorbed into people's consciousness. It's not just going to affect how they think about global warming. It's going to affect who they vote for. It doesn't just affect what clothes they buy. It affects everything that they do. And who they listen to and who they don't listen to. I think that's I mean, if you had interjected into that conversation, I wonder, and sort of gave them a little more idea about what the dangers of AI or how close we are to the tipping point in global warming, I wonder if it would have made a difference to them. They would have gone away and said, well, I know a young couple who were anti-vax before COVID. They were anti-vax for measles. They didn't want to give their kids measles shots, and so, but they were good parents, and they went and they talked to the head of
immunology or something.
Yeah, immunization, whatever it was, at a hospital in Toronto. And he said, you remember that whole kerfluffle about the measles vaccination causing autism. And it's also the fact that it was proven that it didn't have very much effect on the people who decided not to have their children vaccinated. So this couple that I know, they walked away from, the guy at the hospital said there's absolutely nothing dangerous about there's no connection between measles vaccines and autism. And I asked them were they going to change their view, and they said, well, that's his opinion. we're still going to look around for other opinions. Well, it's not an opinion when it's coming from that kind of a source. It's an opinion when you read it on Instagram.
That's so true.
I was wondering if we could change the topic a little bit, because there's you've worked on a new book, the Pandexicon.
Yes.
Yes, and so maybe this is a good transition into Pandexicon from
it's talking about anti-vaxxing.
Yes.
Yeah, that book came out a little over a year ago, in March 2023. What I started doing at the beginning of the pandemic was making a list of all the new words and all the words that were being used to describe the pandemic and to talk about the pandemic, words that we had used for other purposes before the pandemic and words that came up during the pandemic. And I just started reading newspapers and magazine articles and science journals every day, and took note of when those words were used, and then put all of my notes together into a kind of a lexicon of how we talk about the pandemic. My thesis was that these new words had entered the language and therefore entered our lives in a permanent way. We're always going to be using those words in a different way than we did before the pandemic. My simple example was face mask. Before the pandemic, a face mask was something you wore so you didn't lose your teeth when you're playing hockey. And no one is going to think about that now. A face mask is something that you wear during a pandemic. But there are something like 75 words I ended up putting in the book that I put them in as kind of a dictionary entry, but each word spawned a short page or two essay about what that word meant and how it came to be used to describe the pandemic. And what I ended up with eventually was a history of the pandemic, because as different words came into the language, things that they referred to became more important, or phased out. Some of the things that we thought were going to be really important in 2020, we weren't talking so much about in 2022. We were talking about other things. So yeah, it was an interesting book to write, and it really made me feel that the pandemic was something. The pandemic was a life-changing 3 years, for a culture-changing 3 years. I mean, we're still being affected by the things that happened during the pandemic, and people still not going back to work, people not going to sports events as much as they used to, not having parties as much as they used to,
Not going to movies.
not going to movies.
Yeah.
Maybe they're buying books. Maybe they're
Yeah.
buying more books. But I still
I-
have friends. I still have a friend who when we're looking for a restaurant to go into, she'll poke her head in the restaurant, see there's a lot of people in there. She say, "No, it's too COVID-y."
I never
Of
heard
course,
of that before.
Yeah.
I hadn't either. And it was after the book came out. I would have put it in the book if
Well, I tell you, as a teacher, we talk about this a lot. We have informal discussions, we have departmental meetings and division meetings and sort of best practice types of seminars. And one thing that's absolutely true is the learning loss that happened.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
I work with students today, and this is very across the board. We all say it's like, wow, right now, students right now, their readiness level, their prerequisite background skills for the classes that we teach is just a quantum level below where it used to be 5 years or pre-COVID.
Really,
So I mean,
yeah.
talk about still lingering effects. I mean, for me, the most personal, the most noteworthy aspect of COVID now that lives on is the loss in learning, and
Yeah.
it just has it just has a cascading effect, and the fact that it's not equal, because there are some even in my class, you can tell there are some students who fared very well through COVID. Obviously, from Michigan, the students who were living in the more affluent areas had better access to online resources. Their teachers were better equipped, or could ramp up, could pivot, as we say, into this online modality, compared to the less affluent areas where it was basically, in some ways it was worse than no education. It just,
Really, yeah.
it was,
Yeah.
it just, and it's with us to this day.
I read somewhere just a couple of weeks ago that the absenteeism rate has just shot right up. People just, why bother?
Yeah.
And I think that's the phrase that we hear a lot now. Why bother? Why travel? Why commute to work on a for half an hour to sit in a crowded room office and when I can work at home or not work
Right.
at home? I think that kind of psychological, turning all those empty office spaces into condominiums in New York, all of that kind of long-term effect is going to be with us for a long time. And I think something that I haven't seen talked about too much is that sort of, remember we used to talk about environmental fatigue. People just got tired of talking about the environment, and so it sort of got off the list of things that kept them awake at night. Well, I think respiratory illness and pandemic of respiratory illness, if another one comes along in the next little while, people are just going to not pay as much attention to it as they perhaps should. Well,
Right.
here it comes again. I got through the last one. I'll get through this one.
Yeah.
It is worrisome, and there will be another one. I mean,
Yes.
I know I'm sounding a lot of apocalyptic alarms here today, but any epidemiologist you talk to says that there's going to be another global pandemic of some kind of virus in the next few years. There's just too much, and global warming is making that even more possible.
That's right. It's contributing to the.
Yeah.
We would like to thank Wayne Grady for coming on the Great Lakes Guys podcast. Wayne is truly a Great Lakes Guys also. We would like to direct listeners to Wayne's website, waynegrady.ca. That's waynegrady.ca, all lowercase. At the website, there are summaries of Wayne's books as well as a bio for Wayne. for the interested reader. See you next time.
Falls into Ontario and runs on out to sea. The Great Lakes are a diamond on the hand of North America, a bright shining jewel on that friendship border ring. It's a freshwater highway coming down from Canada, and all along the coastline you can hear the people sing, Sweet Mother Michigan, Father Superior, coming down from Mackinac and Sault Ste. Marie, Blue Water Huron.